The man known as the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey, is dead. Officials say he was attacked by an inmate. Harvey killed at least 37 people.
Hearing from the family of victims killed by the man known as the I-5 Strangler, a day after he was killed in his prison cell. Roger Kibbe was serving consecutive life sentences for killing at least 7 women over 2 decades.
Some killers escaped the needle, but behind bars, justice didn't wait. The moment the locks clicked shut, their fate was sealed. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were the ones even other murderers feared. Men who flaunted their evil, mocked their victims, and believed prison offered safety. Inside these walls, safety doesn't exist. There's no shield from the hands of the damned. This is the story of the most hated monsters who died brutally behind bars. Leslie Bailey. He walked into the United Kingdom prison system already marked as one of the most hated men in Britain. His name was tied to a vile network the tabloids called the Dirty Dozen, a secret ring that abducted, abused, and murdered young boys. Bailey personally admitted to carrying out these multiple attacks. He revealed names and described scenes so horrific that the entire courtroom froze in silence. Then came October 7, 1993. Inside Whitemoor Prison, 2 inmates, Michael Caine and John Brooks, entered his cell, and what unfolded would seal Bailey's fate forever. It was not an outburst of rage, but a calculated act. They pulled a cord around his neck and tightened it until silence swallowed the room. By the time the guards arrived, Bailey's body lay motionless on the floor, the ligature still cutting deep into his throat. The real question was how it happened so easily. Caine and Brooks were also segregated prisoners. They had access during free association, but some said the guards skipped their rounds. Others believed the cell door had been left open on purpose. Initially, it looked like suicide, but the medical examiner confirmed it was murder. The attackers were fellow inmates Brooks and Caine, who later admitted they acted in revenge for the children Bailey had harmed. Caine put it bluntly, no one else was willing to do it. The nurse dorm killer. He wasn't just a drifter. He wasn't just a drunk. He was a sadist who turned Chicago into a nightmare in the summer of 1966. Richard Speck was born in December of 1941, raised in a storm of loss and abuse. His father died when he was 6, and his stepfather filled the house with alcohol and violence. By 13, Speck was already drinking and stealing, a runaway on the road to ruin. In July of 1966, that path reached its darkest point. Richard Speck broke into a townhouse, tied up 9 women, and butchered 8 of them in cold blood. Only one survived by hiding under a bed, living to tell the story. Speck escaped, but fate caught up fast. A tattoo on his arm, "Born to Raise Hell," gave him away. He was originally sentenced to die, but when the Supreme Court abolished executions in 1972, his fate shifted. The death penalty was struck down, and his sentence was reduced to life behind bars. What came next only deepened the outrage. In the 1980s, tapes smuggled out of Stateville Prison showed Speck lounging like a king, trading sex with inmates, and mocking the murders as if they meant nothing. He laughed, he bragged, he said killing those nurses was just like swatting flies. There was no regret, no shred of humanity, just decades of life he never deserved. And then, on December 5, 1999, Richard Speck's heart finally gave out. No knives, no fists, no bloody end behind bars, just a quiet death, one far too merciful for a man who gave the world nothing but nightmares. Richard Loeb. Richard Loeb seemed to have it all. He was young, wealthy, and brilliant, and he carried himself as if those gifts placed him above consequence. Born the 3rd of 4 sons into a privileged Chicago family, his father, Albert Henry Loeb, was a powerful attorney and former vice president of Sears, while his mother, Anna Henrietta, came from a Catholic background. On paper, his future looked secure. Yet beneath the polish of money and status, there were deep cracks. Since childhood, he had been stealing small things from friends, family, and stores. By high school, he was showing off his pickpocket tricks just to impress people. In 1924, alongside Nathan Leopold, he lured 14-year-old Bobby Franks into a car. They struck him with a chisel, then dumped his body in a culvert. Their motive was absurd. They wanted to prove they could commit the perfect crime, but nothing about it was perfect. It was grotesque, and it earned Loeb a life sentence inside Stateville Penitentiary. Behind bars, Loeb's arrogance never faded. He manipulated weaker inmates, flaunted his intelligence, and played dangerous games with men who had nothing left to lose. On January 28, 1936, Loeb walked into the prison showers, but he never walked out. Another inmate, James Day, had smuggled in a straight razor. In a flash, Loeb was slashed more than 50 times, his throat ripped open, his hands torn apart from desperate defense wounds. The attack was so brutal that guards first believed a mob had jumped him. But Day claimed he acted in self-defense, insisting Loeb had propositioned him and then attacked. The prison took his word. Case closed. Loeb's death was not revenge for his crime, nor was it part of some prison gang vendetta. It was personal, the kind of violence born from twisted prison dynamics outsiders would never fully grasp. Gerald Schaefer. Gerard Schaefer was a Florida deputy sheriff, a man who looked like law enforcement on the outside, but inside, he was something far darker. Between 1969 and 1972, Schaefer is believed to have tortured and murdered as many as 30 young women. His method was scary. He would stop, pose as a protector, then lure his victims deep into the woods. That was where the nightmare began, and where it almost never ended quickly. Hidden inside his mother's home, investigators later discovered his journals, hundreds of pages where fantasy and reality blurred into one. In those pages, victims were bound, hanged from trees, mutilated, and defiled. Schaefer wasn't just killing, he was documenting. He was officially convicted of just 2 murders and given a life sentence, yet prison didn't silence him. Schaefer couldn't resist running his mouth. He boasted, he taunted, he ridiculed the dead. At times, he even claimed his true body count stretched past 30. Inmates around him listened, some disturbed, others saying nothing at all. One of those silent men was Vincent Rivera. On December 3, 1995, Rivera stepped into Schaefer's cell carrying only a blade. What unfolded wasn't a fight, it was pure chaos. Schaefer was stabbed repeatedly, his neck, eyes, and face taking blow after blow. The deputy who thought the badge would protect him was left to bleed to death on the prison floor. Thorness Christensen. Thorness Christensen seemed like an ordinary young man from small-town California, but behind his quiet demeanor was a monster. Between 1976 and 1979, he stalked the highways of Southern California, picking up young women who looked eerily alike, long straight hair, similar build, same style. Once inside his car, his victims never stood a chance. He would pull out a .22 caliber pistol, shoot them in the head, and then commit unspeakable acts on their lifeless bodies. The murders terrified Isla Vista, sparking protests from students who demanded safer transportation and stronger protections for women. But the killings didn't stop. By the time Christensen struck in Los Angeles, 4 women were dead, and 1 barely escaped with a bullet lodged in her head. That survivor would later spot him in a Hollywood bar and identify him as her attacker, finally putting an end to his spree. Christensen's trials revealed the darkness inside him. Psychiatrists testified about his violent compulsions, his paranoia, and his obsession with the dead. He showed no remorse as he admitted to hunting his victims, stripping them, and exploring their bodies after death. In 1980, he was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, but prison did not bring justice, it brought revenge. Less than a year into his sentence at Folsom State Prison, Thor Christensen was walking the yard when another inmate stepped up and drove a blade straight into his chest. One strike, but it was fatal. The killer was never identified, and Christensen collapsed in the dirt where he bled out. Albert DeSalvo. He admitted to killing 13 people, yet even after his death, one question refused to go away. Was he really the murderer, or just pretending to be? Born in 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the third of 6 children. His father was a violent alcoholic who terrorized the family. He once beat his wife so badly in front of the children that he knocked out all her teeth and snapped her fingers backward until they broke. He even brought prostitutes into the home, forcing the family to watch as he humiliated their mother. In that environment, Albert's dark side began to show early. As a boy, he tortured animals. By the time he hit adolescence, he had already turned to theft and shoplifting. At just 12 years old, he was arrested for battery and robbery and sent to the Lyman School for Boys. He was released a year later, but before turning 15, he was sent back again for stealing cars. After serving his second sentence, Albert tried a different path. He enlisted in the United States Army and even worked as a military police sergeant. Despite a brush with a court-martial, he left with an honorable discharge. But once he returned to civilian life, his name would soon be tied to one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women in the Boston area were murdered. Their ages ranged from teenagers to elderly women in their 80s. Many were sexually assaulted in their own homes and strangled with clothing. One victim died of a heart attack, others were stabbed, and all seemed to have let their killer inside willingly. The press gave him a name: the Boston Strangler. The final victim was 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. She was taken advantage of and strangled inside her Boston apartment on January 4, 1964. A grotesque calling card was left behind. 3 ligatures were tied around her neck, a broom handle was forced inside her body, and a card reading "Happy New Year" was placed near her foot. As fear gripped Boston, police chased every lead. Then, in 1964, Albert DeSalvo was arrested for a string of sexual assaults. His victims described him as the so-called Green Man, a prowler who posed as a handyman or police officer to trick women into letting him inside. At first, police never considered him the Strangler. That changed when DeSalvo confessed to fellow inmate George Nassar. Word spread quickly, and his lawyer, the famous Lee Bailey, took over his defense. The details DeSalvo gave about the Strangler murders were chilling. He knew things that were never made public, but there was a problem. No physical evidence tied him to the crimes. Still, under hypnosis and later in formal interviews, Albert DeSalvo admitted to being the Boston Strangler. In 1967, he stood trial. Bailey struck a deal to spare him from the death penalty. Instead, DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison. But in February of that year, he escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital, leaving behind a note claiming he wanted to draw attention to poor conditions inside. 3 days later, he turned himself in. Albert DeSalvo would never leave prison again. On November 25, 1973, he was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Some said he was killed over drug deals inside. Others believed his silence about the Strangler case made him a target. His killer was never officially identified. Decades later, in 2013, DNA testing finally confirmed that DeSalvo was responsible for the murder of Mary Sullivan. But to this day, many experts argue he could not have been behind all 13 killings. Some believe multiple killers were at work. Others think DeSalvo confessed out of desperation for fame or to protect his family financially. Colin Hatch. Some men should never breathe free air, and Colin Hatch was one of them. In 1993, he abducted, assaulted, and murdered a 7-year-old boy. The crime was so brutal it made him one of Britain's most despised predators. Yet just 5 years later, Hatch was back on the streets. And history repeated itself. In the year 2000, while still under supervision, he lured another young boy into his flat. This time, police found the body quickly. Hatch was caught and sentenced to life behind bars. But prison wasn't punishment. For him, it was protection. Locked in a high-security unit, he bragged, he boasted, convinced he would never face the fate he forced on others. But in 2011, his illusion shattered. Another inmate, Damien Folks, entered Hatch's cell carrying a homemade blade and a ligature. There was no warning, no struggle, just a silent execution. Guards later discovered Hatch's body, stabbed, strangled, left twisted on the floor with his eyes still open. Folks never denied what he did. His explanation was chilling in its simplicity. "I just wanted to get rid of evil." Daniel Camargo Barboza. In 1988, the Spanish news outlet sat down with Daniel Camargo Barboza, just as the courts prepared to hand down his sentence. By then, the 58-year-old had already confessed to the sexual assault and murder of 71 women in Ecuador over only 2 years. But investigators knew the truth ran deeper. What he confessed was just the tip of the iceberg. In Colombia, authorities believed he could be tied to as many as 80 more victims. Back in November of 1984, Camargo did the impossible. He escaped from Gorgona prison, the fortress known as the Colombian Alcatraz. With nothing but a crude wooden boat and a careful study of the currents, he slipped into the ocean. Authorities assumed he had drowned. Newspapers even printed that sharks had eaten him alive. But Camargo hadn't drowned. He resurfaced in Quito, Ecuador, then boarded a bus to Guayaquil in early December. Just days later, on December 18th, he abducted a 9-year-old girl from the city of Quevedo. By the next day, another child only 10 years old had disappeared. What followed was a nightmare stretched across 2 years. Between 1984 and 1986, Camargo carried out at least 54 sexual assaults and murders in Guayaquil. Police could not believe a single man was capable of such brutality, so they assumed a gang was responsible. Meanwhile, Camargo blended into the streets, surviving on scraps of money from selling pens, and at times pawning clothes and trinkets stolen from his victims. From that moment, the killings continued relentlessly until his arrest in February of 1986. When police caught him, he was carrying the blood-stained clothes of his final victim, an 8-year-old girl. For all the horrors he admitted to, Ecuador's justice system could only give him the maximum sentence allowed. In the end, Barbosa spent just 6 years behind bars. He would never taste freedom again. On November 13, 1994, inside Guayaquil prison, his story ended violently. Giovanni Noguera, the nephew of one of his victims, stabbed him to death. Barbosa was 64 when his past finally came back for him. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey, the so-called Angel of Death, earned his place among the most hated killers who ever set foot behind bars. On the outside, he was a hospital orderly, quiet, polite, the man families trusted to care for their loved ones. But between 1970 and 1987, Harvey murdered at least 37 patients, and investigators believe the real count was far higher. He poisoned with arsenic and cyanide, injected insulin, suffocated with plastic bags, and slipped toxins into IV lines, all while smiling at grieving families. He called it mercy. The truth was darker. Harvey killed for control, and he enjoyed it. In 1987, the mask finally cracked. He was handed multiple life sentences and locked away in Ohio's prison system. For years, he blended into the background. Then in 2017, his cellmate, James Elliott Shy, decided Harvey didn't deserve another day. On March 28th, guards found Harvey on the cell floor, skull fractured, ribs broken, body beaten so savagely that survival was impossible. 2 days later, the Angel of Death was gone. The motive was never clear. Maybe Shy discovered Harvey's crimes. Maybe it was prison justice. But one thing was certain. Donald Harvey, the man who once called himself a caregiver, died the way hated men often do behind bars, brutally, without ceremony, and at the hands of someone who didn't fear him. Roger Reese Kibbe. A quiet man with graying hair, a steady job, and the image of a harmless husband. But behind that mask was Roger Kibbe, the predator who would come to be known as the I-5 Strangler. In the mid-1980s, Kibbe began prowling the freeways south of Sacramento under the cover of night. He searched for young women stranded by car trouble, pretending to be their savior. Once they accepted his offer of help, they were driven to remote areas, assaulted, and strangled with their own clothing. At first, he was suspected in only a handful of cases, but proof was scarce. That changed when 2 microscopic fibers tied him directly to one murder. Convicted of first-degree murder, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Still, detectives feared the true scope of his violence stretched much further. Some believed he was responsible for as many as 38 murders. In 2009, as prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty, Kibbe confessed. He admitted to 6 more killings spanning from 1977 to 1986. To escape execution, he pleaded guilty and received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His victims included Lou Ellen Burley in 1977, and young women like Stephanie Brown, Charmaine Sabra, and Catherine Quinones nearly a decade later. Many of them vanished after their cars broke down along Interstate 5, never realizing the man who offered them help was leading them to their deaths. Over time, investigators pieced together his signature. Kibbe had been a skydiver, and the distinctive netting from his parachute equipment became his weapon of choice. Those fibers appeared again and again at crime scenes, the thread that finally unraveled his secret. After more than 20 years, with investigators from multiple counties working tirelessly, the law finally caught up with him, and he was locked behind bars. And then came the final chapter. On the morning of February 28, 2021, prison guards making their rounds at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, found Roger Kibbe unresponsive on the floor of his cell. He was 81 years old. At first, there was confusion. Had he died of natural causes? But the autopsy revealed the truth. Kibbe's death was no accident. He had been murdered. The killer was his cellmate, a convicted strangler named Jason Budrow. Authorities determined Kibbe had been choked to death, killed in the same brutal way he had once used on so many of his victims. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega. Known across Spain as El Matavas, the old lady killer, José Vega was one of the most feared and reviled predators the country had ever seen. Between 1987 and 1988, he murdered 16 elderly women in the city of Santander. Most of his victims were found in their own homes, strangled with scarves, belts, or even his bare hands. Some were sexually assaulted, while others were arranged to look like natural deaths. The horror of his crimes was never rushed. Every act was deliberate. He targeted women who lived alone, women he knew would answer the door. Working as a repairman gave him the perfect cover. Once they let him in, their fate was sealed. Eventually, the authorities caught up with him. After careful investigation, Vega was arrested, and the full weight of his crimes came to light. In court, he smiled through the proceedings, and even called himself a man who had been misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to over 400 years in prison and sent to Topaz Penitentiary. For years, he faded from headlines, his crimes seemingly forgotten by the world. But in his mind, they never left him. In 2002, his time ran out. Two fellow inmates, Enrique Del Val Gonzalez and Daniel Rodriguez Huelo, cornered him in the prison yard. Armed with crude blades and their bare fists, they struck Vega again and again until he finally collapsed. The guards arrived too late to intervene, and some whispered it had been allowed to happen. Enriqueta Martí. In early 20th century Barcelona, a woman promised miracles, but her cures carried a deadly secret. Enriqueta Martí sold potions, balms, and tinctures, claiming to restore youth, fertility, and health. Yet behind closed doors, her remedies were soaked in blood. Known publicly as a healer who helped the sick and desperate, she hid a darkness that would shock the city. Martí was accused of abducting children, some no older than 5, and murdering them to extract fat, blood, and bones for her illicit remedies. The wealthy paid handsomely, asking no questions as she peddled her so-called miracle cures. Her crimes came to light in 1912 when a girl escaped her apartment and alerted neighbors. Authorities uncovered children's clothing, human remains, and jars filled with mysterious substances. The press labeled her the vampire of Barcelona, and public outrage demanded justice. Martí never faced trial. While awaiting sentencing in Reina Amalia prison, she was attacked by fellow inmates. On May 12, 1913, she was reportedly beaten to death. Official reports listed illness as the cause. No autopsy, no investigation, only a closed file and a body no one claimed. Some suspected guards had allowed it. Others believed the attack was fueled by the chilling stories circulating through the cells. Charles Schmid. When it comes to serial killers, Charles Schmid was the full package. A pathological liar with a Napoleon complex, he reportedly began killing teenage girls simply because he wanted to. With help from friends Mary French and John Saunders, he got away with his first murder, the death of 15-year-old Aline Rowe. And once he started, he didn't stop. The next victims were a pair of sisters. Schmid's ego and habit of bragging led him to recruit another friend to help bury them. That friend would eventually turn on him, giving authorities the evidence they needed. In exchange for reduced sentences, Mary French and John Saunders agreed to testify against him, sealing his fate. Schmid had once charmed the teens of Tucson, earning the nickname the Pied Piper of Tucson, according to lifestyle magazine MEL. But charm could not save him from the consequences of his crimes. After almost 10 years in prison, on March 20th, 1975, Schmid was ambushed by 2 inmates who suspected he was a snitch. He was stabbed repeatedly across his body, and though he initially survived, he lost an eye and suffered punctured lungs and intestines. 10 days later, he died. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's dark infamy exploded the night Tracy Edwards, one of his intended victims, managed to escape his apartment and alert the authorities. What police found inside was nightmarish. A 57-gallon drum stuffed with human remains. A refrigerator filled with severed heads. By the time his capture was complete in 1991, Dahmer had confessed to murdering 17 people. A chilling spree that began in 1978. Convicted and sentenced to 15 life terms, his reign of terror seemed over, but prison would not be the end. Dahmer met his death at the hands of fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Scarver explained later that Dahmer's arrogance and twisted humor had pushed him too far. He had mocked his cannibalistic reputation even behind bars, shaping his meals to resemble body parts and joking about taking bites. When confronted with a newspaper detailing his crimes, Dahmer admitted the truth, and Scarver struck, killing him with 2 powerful blows from a weight room bar. According to Scarver, Dahmer's final words were eerily calm. "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me." Even in death, Dahmer's story lingers, a grim tale of obsession, cruelty, and a darkness that seemed impossible to escape. Billy Khmer. In Texas, a man trusted to care for the vulnerable became their nightmare. Between 2016 and 2018, nearly 24 elderly women died under suspicious circumstances across Dallas and Collin counties. They were discovered in their homes or assisted living facilities. No forced entry, no struggle, but valuables were missing, and a dark pattern began to emerge. Authorities soon realized the suspect had been hiding in plain sight, posing as a maintenance worker or medical aid. His method was terrifyingly precise, smothering his victims silently, cleanly, and efficiently. Chamir was charged in connection with 22 deaths and suspected in even more. He denied everything, claiming innocence. Yet surveillance footage, stolen property, and survivor testimony painted a chillingly different picture. In 2022, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But justice didn't have to wait for the courts. In September 2023, inside Texas's C Field unit, Chamir met a violent reckoning behind bars. He was dragged from his cell into a hallway and attacked with brutal force, a fury fueled by outrage and revenge. Stabbed and beaten, he did not survive. His cellmate, Wyatt Busby, was taken into custody immediately. The motive? Chamir had made inappropriate comments about Busby's children. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.